Hello, Garland Nixon here. And yes, I can be quite cynical, but this guy is the Zen master of cynicism, the one and only Mark Sleboda. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with the one and only Mark Sleboda. Mark Sleboda, where can number one, thanks for coming. And number two, where can everybody go to find online to find your evil works, or should I say good works?
I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be on a Thursday evening than chatting with you, Garland. I mean, and I don't even mean that facetiously. So that's how poor my life. Anyway, everyone who's not already following me can follow me on Elon Musk's Twitter X at Mark Sleboda1, or on either or both Telegram and Substack, The Real Politique with Mark Sleboda.
You know, I just put on my Substack, I went to Grok, X's AI bot, and like, why is Garland Nixon not on X? And it was like, well, Garland Nixon is known for controversial and anti-imperialist views. It had on there that he was accused of telling lies about Russia's Ukraine. And I'm like, I think Grok kind of really gets it. You know, I think Grok kind of really gets it.
Yeah, but I checked myself up on Monica. I guess that's another one of these AI bots, and it actually, you know, was fairly flattering. I was surprised. So
yeah, I was surprised that Grok didn't just say, "Oh, he's a Russian bot. Of course he's got to go." Or no, purely he doesn't even have an account. Nobody knows who Garland Nixon is. He's the mystery man.
Garland, we're gonna give you a sci-fi geek test here. Right?
Okay, let's go.
A one-shot quiz. Where does the word grok come from?
Oh my God. It was one of these movies. I forgot. No, I don't remember.
No. It comes from Stranger in a Strange Land, the sci-fi novel, where it is a rough Martian approximation of to understand, but it's supposed to be something that is so deep and not understandable by humans. Yeah, this is Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, and Robert Heinlein is, of course, one of the greatest American and greatest ever science fiction authors, and it actually is a very political kind of pacifist book. And yeah, I mean, I would, Stranger in a Strange Land should be on everyone's high school reading list. Really,
wow.
It should be, right? Because it is a piece. There's some science fiction that's just great science fiction that you enjoy, and then there's other science fiction that is literature that transcends genre. And a lot of Robert Heinlein's stuff certainly fits in that category. And I may be showing my sci-fi fantasy geek domain.
Yeah, man, that's big stuff.
But the fact that Elon Musk also named his bot, his AI Grok, tells me, where him, or at least some of his people's genre loyalties lie. So,
well, I love the Grok, the concept of humans not being able to understand things, because that aligns with the whole Zen philosophies, the Eastern philosophies of what is it? He who thinks he understands the Brahman does not understand, and he who thinks that he doesn't understand does understand. That whole kind of thing. But at any rate, let me ask you this: when it comes to sci-fi movies, one of the greats. Have you ever heard of a movie called The Lathe of Heaven?
No, I haven't.
Oh my gosh. It was a British movie made, I think, back in the 70s. And then there was some issue and it was disappeared. You couldn't find it anywhere for years, and it's back. about a guy who has effective dreams.
Mhm.
And the effective dreams means this. He goes to sleep and he dreams something. When he wakes up, it's that way, and it's always been that way. So like he wakes up and he's laying in the doctor's office, and when he sees these horses running, and he wakes up and there's a picture of horses running on the guy's wall, and he's like, when did that come? That wasn't there when I went to sleep. And the doctor goes, oh yeah, I got it from my brother-in-law 6 years ago, blah, blah, blah. So it's, everything wakes up. And of course, like the government, is either the government, I don't remember, or some big corporation realizes the power of that. And then to take that and to use that power to do, whatever diabolical deeds. And let's just say it goes bad.
So some kind of reality bending, lucid dreaming, or neuromancy, or something like
it's
that.
awesome. Oh, and of course,
to lathe
the
heaven?
Lathe of heaven.
The lathe of heaven.
I'm gonna have to
check that out.
Oh my gosh, man! Because it's someone seeks to harness his power of effective dreams. And
I would considering how really twisted and off the wall my dreams are, thank God that's not.
Yeah. How about that? Exactly. All right. Speaking of twisted and madmen, Zelensky. Lately, he's been going after astronauts and stuff like that, ballerinas. This guy's I think he's losing it. If there's anything left to lose. Mark, what's happening with Zelensky's quest to take down the evil Russian people, former Ukrainians, who I guess he considers that are always Ukrainians, and now they must pay the price.
Yeah. So I think this is just further sign of Zelensky is literally mad. He's insane, right?
Yeah.
His own people telling Simon Schuster that he's delusional. I really think he's off the bend.
Me too.
I'm not even, all the jokes about him and cocaine and whatever. No, I think he's seriously some deranged mentally. Something's wrong with him at this point, right? So one of the things that the Kiev regime has been doing, even predating Zelensky, right? Since it seized power with Western help in 2014, is they have assassinated thousands of Ukrainians, former Ukrainians who no longer identify as Ukrainian, right? People whom they regard as traitors to the regime that overthrew the Ukrainian government and seized power itself. Never mind the irony there. If only Yanukovych had been, a tenth as brutal as these people were regarding someone's loyalty, then the results of the Maidan might not have happened the way they did. But they've assassinated militia leaders, political leaders, activists, anyone who wasn't regarded as 100% politically loyal to the new Maidan regime in Kiev. And they've also pursued all kinds of laws and harassments against Russian speakers. Never mind that Zelensky himself is a Russian speaker, born in Kryvyi Rog, right, to a father who's is in the Red Army, and he struggles to speak Ukrainian, right? He is not a native Ukrainian speaker. He made his fortune in comedy in Russian, right? And some of his own movies can't be shown in Ukraine now without having been dubbed over in Ukrainian, right? It's just a madness. It's a type of insanity, and that hatred of any Ukrainians or former Ukrainians who turned against Ukraine after the West backed Maidan Putsch in 2014, and what the regime in Kiev became. They regard them as traitors, as separatists, and even deserters. And two of them, Zelensky has just off the hinge felt the need to spew vile on in the last week. And the first one was a cosmonaut, and let's use the proper term here, right? If it's a U.S. person in space, it's an astronaut. If it's a Russian person in space, it's a cosmonaut. And if it's a Chinese person in space, it's a taikonaut, right? So we give the space going countries their own specific terminology. But this is he just arrived on the International Space Station this week. Alexei Zubritsky, right? He's a Ukrainian-born Russian citizen, now cosmonaut. He was born in Zaporozhye, but he graduated from a military school in Kharkov and became a pilot and served at an air base in Sevastopol in Crimea. And when the Maidan Putsch and soon afterwards the referendum, the move by Crimea to get out of Dodge, he, with like a very, very large number of the Navy and Air Force in Crimea, the Ukrainian Navy and Air Force, defected. In fact, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, did a report, I assume it's still out there somewhere, where they admitted that 75% of the Ukrainian Navy defected to Russia in 2014, right? Either to Russia directly, or to Crimea and then to Russia, which quickly joined Russia. But he was one of those, and he obviously has proven himself capable since then. And he was selected, as a pilot to undergo cosmonaut training, and he succeeded. And he is a Ukrainian-born, right, Russian citizen who is now on the International Space Station. Well, Zelensky has charged him he faces a 15-year jail term for treason, for desertion, because obviously Zelensky feels that he should be conscripted and sent to the front to die for his regime, right? This is absolutely insanity. So yeah, he's the traitor, cosmonaut, and deserter, right? His property in Ukraine, I guess he still has some, has been confiscated by the regime. And I mean, this is going on while he is literally in space, looking down at this, relatively small blue dot that, I can only imagine how insane he thinks everything is. And he's not the only one. So it turns out that Kirill Dmitriev is this head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, right, which is kind of similar to the U.S. American Chamber of Commerce. It's not a government position; it's a civilian, a business a role, and he is being used by Russia, by Putin, to whom he has some particular affection and loyalty, as Putin's equivalent of Steve Witkoff, right? So whenever Witkoff is there to speak, Kirill Dmitriev is there. And you may remember that Kirill Dmitriev was in Washington last week and evidently spoke to Witkoff in the White House.
Was he the one, who was the guy that was on Fox News? One of the Russian guys?
That was Steve Witkoff. Yeah, I mean, sorry, that was Kirill Dmitriev.
Yeah, I saw him. That was like I think a whole bunch of the neocons heads just exploded. Oh my God!
Yeah. When they asked him about sanctions and whether Russia would agree to a ceasefire for sanctions relief, and he's like, no. We're not that interested in removing sanctions. In fact, there's a lot of Russians, a lot of Russian businesses, the business community. They don't want the sanctions removed, right? Sanctions have been good for Russia. They've helped Russian domestic industries recover, right? After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I believe the premature joining of the World Trade Organization. Now that globalization is dead and everything, apparently, there's no desire to reopen Russia to Western businesses like that. I mean, the Russian economy, Dmitriev pointed out, is growing. It was 4% last year, 4% GDP growth, right? I mean, and that is under more than 18,000 drafts of sanctions, right? And this entire existential economic war, weaponizing SWIFT and all the financial architecture that the U.S. controls. And Russia's economy is growing faster than the EU and the US. Why would we want the sanctions removed? I mean, some people would benefit, right? Some businesses obviously would do, but other businesses are like, no, sanctions forever. Let's keep them. And when Dmitriev said that, we don't really care about your sanctions, right? We survived them. We quickly recovered, and we've grown stronger as a result, and you can't ever hold that blackmail against us again. We're not, it's not a big concern. If they go away, then they go away. But if they don't go, we're not going to beg, we're not going to plead. It's not a bargaining chip for you, over the interests of the SMO. Or
it might go like this. The bargaining might go on sanctions. The Americans might say, well, we'll remove the sanctions. The Russians will say, no way. Unless you keep the sanctions on, you'll never get a deal from us.
If you want to remove the sanctions, that's for you, right? That's not for us. That's to your benefit, so that you can re-enter the Russian market, right? No. I mean, there's certain things like reconnection to SWIFT for agricultural payments and things, but by and large, sanctions relief is one, something that's just not a priority for Russia in negotiations. And two, Russia is perfectly. Putin has spoken, to a meeting of Russia's entrepreneurs and industrialists, and said, I don't actually think sanctions are going to be removed, right? Because a lot of them, the EU, others will have to go through Congress, which will be difficult. And even if there was the will to do it, get used to sanctions. They're the new normal. They're going to be a tool for the U.S. to compete economically when they can't compete on a level playing ground. So that's the new normal. And so Russia doesn't have any expectations with regard to that. Anyway, so Kirill Dmitriev is being used as an equivalent of Witkoff, and he's very involved in these negotiations right now between Russia and the U.S. And Kirill Dmitriev, he's interesting. One of the reasons he's being used is also he was educated. He received part of his education, higher education in the United States. So he speaks fluent English, very good English, and he. The thing is, he was born in Kiev, right? So Zelensky is now attacking him as well, calling him a traitor, and calling for him to be arrested and so forth. He's a Russian citizen now, but the way the regime regards any Ukrainians who don't have loyalty to the Maidan regime since it seized power in 2014. They're all traitors and separatists and deserters and everything else. And the fact that he has to go out while, Kirill Dmitriev is representing Russia in the White House, right? And Zelensky just tone deaf to the way the Trump administration does business. First, they declared him a Russian propagandist. Now they're calling him a Ukrainian traitor and separatist. That's not going to play well inside the White House, right? They're going to see that as, wow, this guy's unhinged, which is really what the case is. And it's just his hatred. He spoke last week about his hatred for Russians. He, who was born into a Russian-speaking Jewish ethnic family in Kryvyi Rog in East Ukraine, which has very large numbers of ethnic Russians and families, on both sides of the border that, you shake a stick. Is a family Russian? Is a family Ukrainian? It's probably both, right? Because the people of East Ukraine don't have the same opinion in general about Ukrainian national identity and about its relationship with Russia as this Banderite ideology of West Ukraine, right? The East Ukrainians, whether they're Russian ethnic or mixed or Russian speaking, or they follow the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, whatever, they generally regard Russians, as a brother people, separated by modern times and a border. And why would we don't have to love them? We don't necessarily have to be part of Russia, although that's changed now since the events of 2014 for a lot of people. But why would we want to be part of a state that is anti-Russian, right? Why? That's not us, right? We don't want that. That's our family. That's and in West Ukraine, it's largely, right, again, not 100%, but largely the opposite. And a big part of West Ukrainian nationalist national identity, they have a very different view of what Ukraine is and what Ukrainians, national identity should be. And the principal component for them is hatred of Russians. Also leftists and Jews and Poles and a lot of other things in there, but primarily it's hatred of Russians. And you can see in a country that before the conflict had 20% of the population being ethnic Russian, and half the country woke up every day. They speak Russian. They regard Russia as a brother country. Ukraine survived as an independent country since 1991 by balancing its own internal and external West and East, right? And part of that was by Ukrainian remaining neutral, right? Ukraine wasn't a part of NATO. It wasn't part of the Russian CSTO. It was balancing. And when that balance was broken by the Maidan Putsch in 2014, beyond repair, and all of the Eastern Ukrainian political parties were lustrated and then banned and driven out of the country and everything, and this West Ukraine came to dominate it. Ukraine was broken then, right? It was never going to recover. That's the decade of civil conflict in the country when the West Ukrainian national identity was tried with Western intention and help, right, to impose their idea of what Ukraine should be on Eastern Ukraine. And Eastern Ukraine wasn't having any of it by and large. Some of them seethed under it, right? Others, in the Donbass actively resisted. Crimea got out of Dodge early. But it's still essentially what's going on today. And Zelensky's hatred of a considerable portion of his own country, right? Half of the half of the country that he came from, and now is lashing out at any person born in Ukraine who doesn't hold loyalty to the Maidan regime that he inherited. He just sounds mad. He sounds bitter and hating and mad. And it's just more and more reason why not only are negotiations impossible with this man, but you just can't leave this regime in power. I mean, and unfortunately, it's not just Zelensky, because before him, the candy oligarch ruler of Ukraine, Poroshenko, right? He wasn't a West Ukrainian nationalist when he came to power either. He was a political insider, right? He had been a part of every Ukrainian government, for since independence at that point. And he was viewed as a pragmatist who could settle things. And no, he internalized all of this like Zelensky did, because the regime that he came to rule, right, after the events of the Maidan, is built on Banderite fascism and this anti-Russian, this need to create an anti-Russian Ukraine by imposing this West Ukrainian identity over Eastern Ukraine by whatever means necessary. And that's still where we are today. And eventually, Russia tried to solve this diplomatically. The Minsk Accords were supposed to reconcile the political events. The East of the country with the west of the country after the events of the Maidan. And supposedly Europe and the US, agreed that this was the only way forward. They kept mouthing those words. There are no other options, but they've since admitted, Merkel, Sarkozy, Macron, they've all, and Poroshenko himself, all admitted that they never intended to fulfill the Minsk Accords. They just wanted to build up a powerful NATO armed and trained Kiev regime military that could crush the Eastern Ukrainian resistance once and for all, impose their identity on Ukraine by force, and become a bulwark for the West against Russia. And Russia just couldn't, for security reasons, for concern about the Russians and the quote unquote pro-Russians, the East Ukrainians, they couldn't allow this to happen. If it was being done to the U.S., they would have already nuked. They already would have nuked somebody as a result of this. This hatred of someone who should be celebrated. I just, whether you're an American or a Russian, there's still this very correct heroization of those people that managed to escape the orbit of this planet and that we choose to put up in space. They're supposed to be the best of the best. They've accomplished things, and rather than being proud of them, you charge him with treason and demand that he be arrested on the International Space Station, right, by, I guess, the one American astronaut up there, all right, and I don't know, deported to the Kiev regime in Ukraine. It's madness.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Now, the latest, he's got bigger fish to fry. The North Korean, the millions, hundreds of thousands of North Koreans who were, replaced all the Russians. Virtually, there were no Russians fighting in the new territories or any of Eastern Ukraine. It was all North Koreans. We know that was going on. And suddenly they all departed. I don't know if you've heard the latest. They've been replaced by the Chinese. Now they claim they got a couple of, and I looked at those guys and I'm like, they kind of look like they're from Siberia or, with a Pacific part of Russia somewhere. Get out of here. But he's like, yes, I got a picture. The Chinese are now the North Koreans. Mark, that's yesterday's news. The Chinese are in now. Have you been following this crap?
Yeah. And so, this was put out by Zelensky himself, right? First of all, it has to be said, to my knowledge and sincere belief, there have never been any North Korean troops fighting for Russia in the special military operation. Like, Russia and North Korea are allies now, right? But they haven't done any military drills together since before the collapse of the Soviet Union. They have no interoperability whatsoever. There probably are some North Korean military in Russia, right? Undergoing training, going to military academies, learning to work together, maybe even some behind the contact lines, learning what real time, all the very useful things that, Russians are doing with logistics and drones and artillery and the like. And North Korea has provided some munitions and weapons, right? But have North Koreans been fighting? No, Russia doesn't need them, right? It has no problem with manpower. No one is going to suggest that they do. And there's just, it would be more of an impediment, right? Because they haven't drilled together. This is why Russian and Chinese troops do train together, now practically every month or every other month, right? There's some kind of drill going on. To my knowledge, there's never been any evidence that the North Koreans have been fighting. This is a propaganda piece that was put forward by Zelensky and ignored by Western governments and media, if you'll remember, for about 2 months, until Biden suddenly latched on it, right, as his justification for the Biden firing ATACMS ballistic missiles into Russia. And that was done at the time, they claimed, in response to North Korean troops, right, that no one could ever identify, no one ever find. And there was even an article, the BBC went and talked to Kiev regime soldiers in Kursk when they were still there. And they asked them about this, and they're like, nope, haven't seen any North Koreans, And they had a quote at the end of the article by one of them who said, it can be very hard to find a North Korean soldier at night in the dark forests of the Kursk region, especially when there's none there. So
that makes it tough.
BBC didn't comment on it. They didn't develop that. What does that mean? Right? No, they just kind of threw it out there and then walked away from it, never revisited. And Western media still repeats that today. That you notice the Trump administration hasn't brought up this North Korean fiction at all. Well, it was done to try to say, hey, the North Koreans are fighting. You have to send troops. You have to send more weapons, right? Blah, blah, blah. Well, now Zelensky is obviously feeling the need for attention and more support and weapons and Western troops. So now he's fighting the Chinese, right? And you have to believe that this is part of, his, again, misreading of how to win friends, and influence people in the Trump administration. Trump hates the Chinese, right? Trump tariffs on the Chinese. Therefore, we're fighting the Chinese, right? And that's exactly, where this comes. And no one is picking this up, right? Now, to be fair, there have been a relatively small number of Chinese volunteers, right, who have fought first on the side of the Donbass militias, right? Since 2014, I've seen some reports, some interviews with some of them, but they might even face charges back in China, right? It's not legal for them to do so, right? I don't know how actively they're pursuing that, right? But this is not anything supported by the Chinese government, right? And the AP. In reporting this nonsense, even correctly noted that, to their knowledge, to what is believed, that China is buried in the article on the AP. The article is China denies significant number of its citizens are fighting for Russia in Ukraine. A nice dubious title there. In the middle of the article, they put the one line, China is not believed to have knowingly provided with troops, weapons, or military expertise. i.e., China is not involved in this at all, right? Not with troops, not with weapons, not with anything else, right? The best you can claim, and the West tries to do it all the time, is because China continues to conduct economic trade with Russia, that is facilitating Russia's war. I mean, and to a degree it is, right? Russia and China do a lot of business, right? I don't think that Russia would stop the SMO if China bowed to U.S. sanctions war, Western sanctions war, and stopped all trade with Russia. First of all, the global energy markets and commodity markets would tank. But aside from that, right? Prices would go through the roof. But it would make things more difficult for Russia, sure, right? There would be some actual probably belt tightening. There wouldn't be 4% economic growth, right? Despite all these sanctions. But that's it. And one of the things that has to be realized is, where do you think the Kiev regime gets most of its drones? Right. Those drones are bought from China.
There's like DJI and Mavic drones that are all Chinese drones that they buy on the open market.
Right? They buy drones, they buy parts, they assemble them in underground workshops, right? Russia does, some. They also get parts, from China in this regard. But they have their own industries that build them as well. The Kiev regime doesn't, right? They get all of their drones that they're killing Russians with, right? And we have the report from Russia right now. 75% of all Russian casualties, inflicted by Kiev regime troops are from drones, mostly FPV drones now, right? It's not artillery. And part of that is because the Kiev regime just doesn't have much artillery or artillery shells anymore. They have to rely more and more on drones. But both sides are using drones so extensively. And most of those drones, in whole or in part, come from China.
And someone was in the chat saying, "Oh, it's terrible that China sell them." Here's what you don't realize: you don't have to buy them from China.
No,
you know what
no,
I mean? I mean, there's tens of thousands of. You can buy them in the U.S., South Korea, all over the world. There's DJI and Mavic drones. All you have to do is go to any country and order them, and anybody in the world. That's the whole thing about the whole issue of sanctions or whatever. People just buy things through third countries. Anything you want, you can get it through a third country. China could say, we're not going to sell them to you, but somebody in some country is going to buy truckloads for them and reroute them around. So people are always going to get their hands on what they want.
That's actually, I mean, that is exactly what's happening. In fact, it took China a while, but a few months ago, they did put restrictions on drones, right? But you're right. They just sell them to third countries, and the third countries transfer them to Ukraine. And that's how Russia has gotten by all these sanctions, for all these years now. Since it was certainly,
I think they get their airplane part because, like Boeing in the U.S. said, no airplane parts for Russia whatsoever for your fleet, and they just buy them from like China and other countries.
There's a slight markup. Someone in Turkey or the UAE or Azerbaijan, whoever, is glad to take a markup, a certain percentage, right? It makes things more expensive, right? But there's really no ability to stop these types of things in a globalized world, unless Biden was increasingly trying to sanction the world to get them to stop trading with Russia.
Mark, I know some people that have done some stuff like that, and there's even competition for the markups. So somebody in a country says, hey, I want to buy stuff from this country that I'm sanctioned. And the guy says, all right, I'll sell them to you with a 10% markup. A guy in another country says, well, I'll sell them to you with a 6% markup. So now the countries are negotiating and fighting over who can get the deal for to be the third party. So you're going to find whatever the hell you want. There's no way to stop the signal, as they say.
Yeah. So this whole China thing, there are no Chinese troops fighting for Russia. Again, there might be some individual volunteers. I don't even believe that these one or two people who were captured supposedly by the Kiev regime, I don't even know. There's no evidence that they're even Chinese, volunteers, right? When a video or showing one of these supposed Chinese fighting for Russia was uploaded to social media, Twitter, X, I believe. Here's the thing. They forgot to remove the original name of that file. So for the first number of hours that was up, if you downloaded that file, then you could see the file name. And the file name was North Korean soldier. That was the name that Zelensky's own people had for that file, right? Which I'm sure that Russia has some 200 ethnicities, right? They don't all look like me or other people out there. There are Russians of African origin, from the Soviet and since period, right? But there are 200 indigenous ethnicities, many of them Asian appearance, right? Almost certainly these North Korean, these two North Korean soldiers, they're from Tuva, right? There are actually some, not a huge number, but there are a small number of Korean Russians as well. There were Koreans who are natives of Russia and so forth. Russia has hundreds and hundreds, again, 200, but many Asian ethnic minorities, the various peoples of Siberia and the Far East, right? So there's no indication. One of the pieces of evidence, like he had a Chinese bank card. Chinese bank card? Really? Like I don't know. Everything I've seen about China, they don't even use bank cards. They all use mobile phones to pay for everything in that country. They're way more advanced than Americans are, certainly in that regard. I have to admit, in Russia, where they've all gone to I'm one of the old farts still using a card. Everyone else around me is still using the phones. I'm gonna have to do that one of these days, I guess. I'm showing my age and my inherent ludism. I guess in that regard. But I don't believe that this guy, even though there are a handful of Chinese volunteers, this guy isn't China. This is just Zelensky crying for attention and aid and trying to play off what he thinks, is the Trump administration's animosity towards China, and hoping that'll somehow increase Trump's, sympathy for Zelensky and the Kiev regime. I don't think it's going to work. I think that's really clumsy. Again, they just don't know how to play Trump, right? I mean, Trump is everyone recognizes that he's narcissistic, self-aggrandizing egotist, right? He loves having his vanity stroked. But you have to know how to do it. And it doesn't work so much if he doesn't have any respect for you already, right? Then, he sees it as a gesture. Other than that, he sees it as the ass kissing he is due by someone who is a beta, right? To his alpha. And whether it's Keir Starmer or Macron or Zelensky, they don't know how to play him. They just run it completely wrong. And when Russia does it, Putin can play Trump better, right? He has a little more respect for them, and so it doesn't come off the same way. And it has to be said that Russia's much more sophisticated about it, I think. And there was an interview that Trump did about the tariffs in this last week, about his war of tariffs on the world. And he was gloating. He was, like a puffed up, I don't know, bullfrog or something, right? All in his alpha dog mode, saying that all the world leaders, of the sanctioned country or its tariff countries are coming. And he says, to kiss my ass, right? He used those words, right? And he was laughing and saying, they're all coming and crying and begging and groveling. Please, sir, we'll do whatever you want. Just remove these tariffs, right? And he was just the contempt that he shows for most of the rest of the world it's palpable. It's palpable. And he obviously enjoys this type of, seeing people grovel before him. He kinds of expects it. And there's the fact that the Chinese are not, of course, singles them out for punishment. But I'll be willing to bet that Trump has a lot more respect for them as someone who stands up to him, right? He may react angrily to that, but at another level, he also has a lot more respect for them than he does, say for the Indians. China has called for the Indians to stand with them against the U.S. Tariff war, the trade war, and India is like, crickets chirping. And the Indians have put out that no, they're not gonna do that. They're not gonna retaliate. They've got their people. They're going to cut a deal with Trump behind closed doors, and they hope to have a deal by the fall. That was the autumn. That was the word coming out, and it's one of those. The majority of the world is genuflecting. They're bowing. They're kowtowing to Trump. They're rolling over and showing their belly to the alpha dog. Now, Russia's not put in this position right at the moment because Trump hasn't put any sanctions or any tariffs on Russia or Belarus, or it must be said, these other countries that are already so ridiculously sanctioned that it's kind of pointless.
He already knows the answer with Russia. You know what I mean? He already knows the answer. He already knows if he swings, they ain't duck. They ain't gonna duck. They ain't gonna duck. They're gonna fight back. So he doesn't have
any chance of any peace settlement, and no matter how slim, would go completely out the door.
Now let's talk about this. There was a town I remember when they were talking about what was the big one where the Wagner people fought for I don't know how long, months and months. Bakhmut. And after that, the town they were talking about a lot was Seversk, and saying if Seversk falls, boy, they're really screwed, blued, and tattooed, right? I understand Seversk. Things ain't looking all that great for Seversk and other places. I also understand the Russians are really on the move right now. They're not coming out. The Russians aren't saying, unlike the Ukrainians, who literally put out a trailer for their offensive. They literally had like a trailer. Hey, we like Hollywood trailer for their offensive. We're going to do it. This is where we're going to do it. This is when we're going to do it. This is how we're going to do it. This is what we're going to use. Oh my God. How did the Russians figure out we were going to do an offensive and thwart it before we even got started? The Russians aren't screaming there's an offensive going on. I get the feeling something's up. What's happening on the battlefield, Mark?
Okay, so I don't think that Russia has started their spring summer offensive per se yet, right? I haven't seen the large introduction of these new troops. The Kiev regime says that Russia, and I completely believe them, has some 150,000 trained, armed troops, some 15 divisions that they haven't put into the conflict yet, right? And I think we're going to see them in the late spring or summer. Mm-hmm. But there's no question that Russia is now pressing hard again on all the contact lines. There was a bit of a slowdown in February, March. Part of that is the weather, right? And Russia's starting to pick up again. It has to be said that it's still technically the Rasputitsa, right? It's the mud season in Russia this spring, and wet fall, wet autumn. They're really bad, because you can't do anything off-road, right? You can't do big, any type of maneuver offenses. It makes logistics difficult. It doesn't mean that everything stops. It doesn't mean that you don't, but it has to be factored in. And there's another thing is that Russia actually transferred quietly rather large numbers of troops to the Kursk region, right? They were ready that if Russia's gambit with that pipeline, Russia used the pipelines to get troops behind lines, and the whole Ukrainian positions crumbled and they fled, right? But if that hadn't worked, Russia was still going to take the Kursk region back, and they had actually transferred significant amount of troops from other fronts to do that, right? They didn't want to, evidently. These new 150 weren't ready yet, right? They were maybe finishing up training. They're allocated for other things. But when the Kursk worked so successfully and so easily, both sides, particularly Russia, because much more of their troops survived, they were barely used, they started transferring them back to the other parts of the front line. The Kiev regime was doing it as well. That's why they launched this another insane suicide attempt to break into the Belgorod region, which has netted them absolutely nothing over the past 3 weeks. But those were troops from the failed Kursk incursion, right? That were sent there. Russia transferred most of these troops, or a significant part of them, already back to different front lines, and they've been pressing hard now for really the last 2 weeks. And Russia has the manpower to do that. They've been increasing as well fab attacks, these glide bombs. They've just been pressing everywhere. And the idea is, again, it's an attritional strategy. They're trying to force the Kiev regime to shuffle troops here, shuffle them there, exhaust them, attrit them. And, eventually they believe that they'll crumble. They'll crumble locally in places like they did in Kursk, or as there's some evidence now that they're crumbling finally in Chasiv Yar, or in central Donbass region, or in Seversk. Seversk is in the Donbass region. It is kind of the northernmost stronghold, right? It is north of Bakhmut. There was an analogous in the south. That was Ugledar, right? Russia already took Ugledar back months ago. And these two positions were kind of like strong fortifications that held the Kiev regime line at either end. And it has to be said, Russia's been trying to take Seversk for like 2 years now, more than 2 years. And it hasn't worked out well. It's a very challenging geography there. You have to take all the heights that are to the south and west of the city, right? They're actually, from my understanding, in so tactically more important than the town of Seversk itself. And Russia changed up the command there, and there was previously some scandal about the general there claiming that he had made more progress than he actually had, and he was actually lying to the command. Anyway, now it looks like Russia's finally getting serious and has changed up Seversk. And they're doing the same thing in Seversk that they're doing to Pokrovsk. And it is a strangulation strategy, right? They're spreading out on both sides. They're trying to cut off the supply lines going in, using troops, using artillery, and of course, using drones. And they're having more success with this than they've had, going straight up or trying to attack Seversk from the west or the south or what have you. From the east or the south. And evidently right now, the defensive position for the Kiev regime, it's critical. Right, they're in a bad way, and they're talking publicly. Their own commanders are saying how bad it is, and that they risk being trapped in a cauldron. The same thing is a little more slowly. The Kiev regime has put more reinforcements in counterattacks south of Pokrovsk to delay this. They could see the Russian strategy, and to some limited effect. Right. I think they probably bought a month or maybe 2 months, right? For Pokrovsk. But the question is always, at what cost? What did they spend in manpower and equipment and munitions that could have been used elsewhere rather than defending a position that is, inevitable at this point. But everywhere, Russia had taken Toretsk, and then the Kiev regime counterattacked there over the last 6 weeks. And again, they bought some time, but now Russia has forced them all out of Toretsk again. Very similar in the only thing that the Kiev regime holds in Chasiv Yar is some suburb community on the outskirts, as far as I understand, and they're pressing them hard out of there as well. So everywhere they're under a lot of pressure. Now they're also kind of where there's, you want to call it a new front or a new active front, is in the south, and that's in Zaporozhye. And Russia is starting to make big steps towards the town of Orehov. And town, small city. Orehov is where the Kiev regime headquartered their failed NATO-planned 2023 summer offensive to the south, right? So now Russia's recovered all of that, and now they're going to where that was launched from. And past that is Zaporozhye city itself. And that is one of the places where I expect to see, they're pressing hard there now. But that is one of the places that Russia could choose to inject all or some of all of those new 150,000 new troops and make a major effort to take Zaporozhye city and the Dnieper, start moving up the Dnieper there. That's a real possibility. Another one, of course, is in the Sumy region where Russia is also advancing. So they pushed them out of Kursk, and now they've taken territory in Sumy and to the south of the Kursk region, right, in Ukraine. And this is where Russia actually, at the beginning of the conflict, this is one of the ways they got to Kiev, right? They went from the Kursk region, they just drove through Sumy city and down to Kiev, right? It's a shot from there. And this right now, it's being called making a buffer zone. But that really could very easily turn into taking the regional capital, Sumy. And now Sumy's going to have a referendum. Sumy People's Republic.
Is that part of the territories that Russia is claiming they have to take, they have to have as a part of
No,
any deal?
no, they're not. No, that would be anew. That would be if you don't play ball and give us, what our demands are now, right? And then we could move on Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov and Sumy. Basically everything east of the Dnieper. And Sumy is east of the Dnieper, right? So that is a possibility moving in. And I do think a move on Kiev would make a lot of sense. I think that is one of the ways to shorten this conflict, right? By going for Kiev. So there's every possibility that there could be a big offensive there. In fact, you could see Russia launching attacks late spring, early summer from the north and the south at the same time, while they're continuing the attritional strategy up the center of the Donetsk region, right? And once, Seversk and Pokrovsk now are the north and south in the Donetsk region. They're both being strangled. And Russia is starting to move on that last defensive line, the Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinovka line. Russia's already making there's news about Russian rapid advances behind lines towards Konstantinovka today. We'll see how that pans out. It's a lot of fog of war right now. But this is the last. Once this is taken, and I believe this will be taken, this defensive line will be taken no later than the end of this year, right?
Well, there's another factor. There's another critical factor before we go that I think affects it, and that is, look, there's a number of ways to defeat someone, but one is this, and that is to make them run out of ammo. Here's my point. They've got a limited amount of ammo. They got a stockpile that, the Biden administration poured into them before they, before Biden left office. That's going to last. And they projected it to last till midsummer. However, if the Russians are pressing them on all fronts, it's going to force them to expend more ammunition defensively, which means it won't last as long. Maybe not even up to midsummer, but let's say it lasts until midsummer. Just for the sake of argument, I would think it would be exhausted sooner, and that would be part of the pressing. If you only got a limited amount, I press you everywhere, I make you use your, and now if you got 12 weeks of ammo, it turns into 6 weeks of ammo, right?
Yeah.
But at that point, the way things are going in the U.S., I just don't see any way Donald Trump can go back to Congress and say, I need another $70 billion for ammo. And even if he did, he'd have the $7 billion, but nobody has the ammo to sell them. Yeah. So my point is, as the Russians project this out to summer or whatever, at some point, they're going to have an opponent who's looking around saying, anybody got any bullets? No. How about you? No. Yeah. I think we better run.
Yeah, that's part of the attrition strategy, right? And I agree with you. They are going to face a moment several months from now when they're going to have much less ammunition and munitions available. Now, they're never going to run out completely, right? And the reason for that is Europe is not stopping, right? They're trying to increase production. They'll never make up for the U.S. But the U.S. is still sending in particular ammunition, artillery shells, because a lot of what Biden provided was not stuff, right? Direct drawdown off of Pentagon shelves. A lot of it was long-term contracts with the U.S. military industrial complex, right? The assistance fund. So unless Trump cuts them off from that completely, that will keep going. That's already paid for, right? And so it's what the U.S. military industrial complex is capable of producing on a monthly basis. Most of that by contract already goes to Kiev, right? And that will continue until and unless Trump cuts it off. Now, obviously, that's not enough. It wasn't enough in 2023. It wasn't enough last year, right? Russia's producing a lot more. Mark Rutte, Russia outproducing all of NATO put together, by more than 3 times, blah, blah, blah. We've heard it again and again. But they will have less, but they'll never be completely out. It will never be, oh, we don't have anything left, we surrender. They will have to make hard decisions going forward. They just won't be able to do what they're doing now, which is desperate attempts to hold everywhere and fight for every scrap of territory, well past any point of strategic sense or rationality. And the munitions and ammunition shortfall will definitely start to tell as well on the battlefield. Just don't ever expect them to be, they've gone through all of everything that Biden said in 3 months, and that's it. They're out. They're done. They got to surrender. Not gonna happen that way exactly, I don't think.
All right. Well, Mark Sleboda, where can everybody go online to find all of your good works?
Yeah, you can depress yourself and take the black pill at Mark Sleboda 1 on Elon Musk's Twitter X, or preferably Telegram and Substack at The Real Politique with Mark Sleboda.
And I didn't say evil works for this time. And I'll give everybody the quick background on that. So when my daughter was young, one day she's in the room watching Johnny Quest. That was I turned her on to Johnny Quest, right? Because that was my favorite cartoon. And so she's watching it online or whatever, right? And I walked in and I said, "What's going on?" And she says, "Well, that's Dr. Zen. And he's dying." Remember, the guy, Dr. Zen, he's dying. And those are his 2 daughters, and they're going to carry on his evil works. And I said, "Well, you know what? If I die, I certainly hope you carry on my evil works." And of course, she'd be, "Dad." So that's why I always say we must carry on our evil works like the daughters of Dr. Zen. But Johnny Quest was the best, man.
Johnny Quest was good. I was more of a Thundar the Barbarian.
Oh my gosh. Well,
Johnny
did you see when they redid that, right?
No, I didn't.
Don't.
Yeah,
don't.
Yeah,
Thundar was a female.
Who
was? It gets worse. Who was a lesbian and had a black girlfriend, and the merry band of barbarians that she led with her were vegans.
Look, I've got no problem with a female barbarian, Red Sonja, right? Great, right? I got no problem with a barbarian of African descent, right? I've got no problem with a lesbian barbarian, right? You can combine them all
Chamberlain with
but you don't change what has already been done out of a woke political agenda. That is just no.
And they were vegans. Thundar the Barbarian and his merry band of barbarians are now gay vegans. I'm like, oh, Washington, D.C. Why? Okay. I mean, L.A., why do you do this to us? Why did they punish us?
Vegan barbarians, that one stretches my concept.
They usually have like an ostrich leg. The barbarians have like this giant Fred Flintstone kind of ostrich leg. And they're just gnawing, tearing on it. That's what a barbarian is. I guess they're eating some pasta with lentils or something.
No new Thundar the Barbarian or Johnny Quest. Stay with the original.
Yeah, the original was awesome. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mark. Everybody, don't forget, follow Mark Sleboda online and keep at Substack, keep up with all his good works. And also, since Mark is still on X, you can follow him on X. He's got lots of great, what do you call, you don't call them tweets anymore. What do they call them anyway? Did they still call them tweets? Posts. There we go. All right, we're out.